Thank you all for coming here this evening. I know that you have many other claims and demands on your time, and it's just so nice to see a full room here, and we appreciate the interest and the support. I don't need to remind anybody here that the way that here in this country people are reeling with just one incident of gun violence after the next. Of course, the Pittsburgh massacre had particular resonance in Israel, and I also have family in Pittsburgh, but today the Reshet Bet, the state news radio station, they concerned that, as we all know, the media has become a hothouse, a cabal of leftists. The new practice is that most of the shows have two MCs, one more to the right, the other I wouldn't really say to the left, I would say center. And the 5 o'clock news show, the right-wing MC is a man by the name of Yigal Gueta, who was formerly a member of Knesset for Shas, the ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party. I've heard him really tear into LGBTQ folks or advocates. Although interesting, the reason he had to leave the Knesset was because he went to his gay nephew's wedding, and that was a no-no. I've heard him really speak very nastily to the leader of the reform movement in Israel. But so after the Pittsburgh shootings, they were interviewing many folks from Pittsburgh on Israeli radio, and particularly rabbis. And the Chabad rabbi, the ultra-Orthodox Lubavitch Rebbe, not Rebbe, but rabbi, was talking. And for those of you who don't know, or maybe you do know more, because Squirrel Hill has been such in the news ever since this tragedy, it's a very close, tight community between Jews, between people of different faiths. I'm sure you heard that the Muslim community raised some $190,000 to support the Jewish community and offered, said, we will come and guard your synagogues. That's the kind of place it is. And when the Chabad rabbi spoke, and we know that throughout, in so many places, certainly in Israel, like Gueta himself, there is such animosity. To hear this rabbi speaking of the communal connections and solidarity that didn't just start with this tragedy that had been ongoing. And he says, Gueta says, why can't we do this here? You know, we have something to learn from America. And of course, if there's anything that one dares call a silver lining from this terrible tragedy, one of many, it is the way it brought so many people both in Pittsburgh and around this country together. And a message there which sometimes is lacking in my place of residence. This idea that at some point we have to recognize what unites us, what brings us together, is ultimately more important than that which differentiates between us. Many of us know, of course, the command in the Torah, in the Bible, to love one's neighbor as oneself. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And I actually would say that neighbor is a mistranslation. Well, I would say is really the one who is essentially like you. And if we start with the belief that every human being is created in God's image, and that's certainly part of our Jewish tradition, then there is something very basic that unites us. If we think of what's called the Watchword of the Jewish faith, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, I often say, Hear, O Israel, Adonai our God, Adonai is one. It's God's oneness that makes us all one, in a very, very basic way. That's all I have to say. Of course, I'll say something more, but I don't think there is much more to say. I think wherever we are, that is our most basic human task. That spirituality starts with the ability to see what is holy and special and important in every human being. When I was talking with the students in one of the schools which the Wholistic Peace Institute had me speaking in today, which was such a wonderful, wonderful experience. I was speaking a little bit about idolatry. I don't know too many people today that worship golden calves. There probably are some somewhere. I don't know them. It's become almost cliche, true but cliche, to say that money and power are some of our modern forms of idolatry. But when I was a congregational rabbi many moons ago, most synagogues in the United States or Canada, and I've seen this in many churches as well, less so in mosques, and you should be proud of this, I think. But there's a tradition that in the synagogues, on one side of the ark where we keep the Torah scrolls, you have an American, U.S. or a Canadian flag, on the other side an Israeli flag. And when I was a congregational rabbi, I removed the flags from the worship hall. Flags move me. When I see an Israeli flag or a U.S. flag, it can move me. When I hear a national anthem, it can move me to tears. So it's not that I think that these things are inherently bad or wrong. But what I do think is that that's why I know these things are dangerous. The things that move us, because they're good things essentially, those are the things that are most likely potentially to become idolatry. Not the clearly bad things. In the Jewish tradition, the land of Israel is holy. It is the Ot HaBrit. It is a sign of the everlasting covenant between God and the Jewish people. In our tradition, of course, that covenant has never been abrogated. And one of the things that we deal with in this land that we call holy, and the so-called hilltop youth, for example. I mean, the last time I was attacked by settlers, it's happened a number of times. You can just Google Ascherman knife and see one of the more dicey examples. I'm lucky to be here. But this today, these so-called hilltop youth who attacked us, and on this particular day I got away with just one stitch. It could have been much worse again, I suppose. They, as so many settlers, they are intoxicated by the holiness of the land of Israel. And it's not that I don't share their belief that the land of Israel is holy. But when one uses, in the name of this holiness, you believe that this gives you the right to dispossess other people, then you are practicing idolatry. Because the holiness of the land of Israel, as real as it is, has blinded you to the only thing that is created in God's image. And it's not the land. The Palestinian shepherd whom you're preventing from making a living, or the farmer who you're cutting down his olive trees, though that person is created in God's image, and for that reason we must protect and honor his or her human rights, and not the land, and not the flag, and not the national anthem, and not peoplehood. If we believe that every human being is created in God's image, and again, I apologize. I know that for those of you in the Islamic tradition, that's a more complicated concept. You have in the Quran other concepts which get to the same idea of the inherent worth of every human being. Then that demands of us something. It demands, and that's why although my new organization is a very small one, and the logical thing, until we become larger and have more resources, and of course, hopefully you'll help us a lot tonight, and so we'll have a lot more resources, but would be to choose one project. But we can't do that, because the medium is the message. And if our message is that every human being is created in God's image, then it has to, that means the Palestinian farmer or shepherd, it means the Bedouin living inside Israel, it means Israeli Jews, it means African asylum seekers. And that's why we are arguably spread pretty thin, because each of these projects needs our attention in one way or another. The next thing I wanted to say a word about is power. Arguably, the Jewish people would at least be strong contenders for the dubious title of most oppressed people in history. Potentially some other contenders. And that leaves scars. That leaves scars on our souls. And the essence of Zionism is the idea that a root cause of our oppression as Jews was the fact that we were stateless and homeless. And for 2,000 years we prayed for our right of return. We prayed. Some tried to return. Many were slaughtered when they did so. And then we got what we prayed for. And then what? That's when things get more complicated. There was a late or mid-19th century rabbi by the name of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, one of the founders of modern Orthodoxy. And although he's writing several decades before Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism, he writes the following. First of all, he says, the Torah is predicting that someday we're going to have a state. He's writing in the mid-19th century. And he's commenting on, does anybody know for a gold-plated matzo ball, what is the most frequently repeated command in the entire Torah, in the first 5 books of the Bible? We've got some Jewish studies people. We've got some ringers here. What would that be?
Shall love the stranger.
How we treat the again, stranger is another mistranslation as far as I'm concerned, the non-Jew living among us. I mean, that's a whole debate, how to transfer it, the word ger, but Ibn Ezra, I think, makes it clear. I think already way back when God figured out this was going to be the most difficult command to obey, and that's why it's repeated more than any other. And Hirsch says the following. He says, Toevat Mitzrayim, the abomination of Egypt, not modern Egypt, but ancient Egypt, was simply this. They believed that the absolute power they had over us gave them the right to do with us as they wished. He says the source of our slavery, of everything that we suffered, was simply that, this idea that might makes right. And then he says, as I said, someday the Torah is saying we're going to have a state, and it's issuing a warning. That's his words, a warning. Will we be different? Human nature, arguably, is to do unto others what was done to us. The psychologists teach us that those who are beaten as children are much more likely to beat their own children. As I've said, we were beaten a lot. And in that sense, some of the things that we see today, which I certainly find wrong, objectionable, Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name, are just carrying out human nature. But the Torah tells us to do differently. I often talk and quote Hirsch when I'm speaking to soldiers or police officers in a very tense situation. When we're maybe doing an act of civil disobedience, or we've been detained or arrested for whatever reason. Human rights does not, doing human rights work, you cannot shirk from conflict. It's not just, can we all get along? There's a wrong that has to be righted, and someone's responsible, and something has to be named. But obviously, but it doesn't mean that soldier is my enemy. even if he's doing something which I find objectionable. He or she is also created in God's image. And some of my most satisfying experiences are sometimes, just recently, we were accompanying shepherds, as we do in the Jordan Valley, and settlers, if we're not around, they often just come in and chase away or intimidate or use violence against the Palestinian shepherds. When we're there, they usually prefer to get the army to come in and do the dirty work and not do it themselves. And our very presence often makes a difference. I mean, it's so easy to look at the glass half empty. But one day we were talking with some of the shepherds that we were working with, and we were so, from our point of view, fixed on what we hadn't yet accomplished or what we accomplished and had been reversed. And these shepherds said, "What are you talking about? Before you came, we couldn't move a meter." And if you're a shepherd, particularly in a place like the Jordan Valley, which is so arid, in the best of circumstances, you feed your flocks through a combination of what they can do by grazing and what the feed you have to buy. And of course, if the percentage of what you have to buy becomes too large because you're being prevented from accessing grazing land, then it becomes economically not viable, and that can lead to dispossession. Nobody has to kick you out. You'll leave on your own accord because you can't survive financially. So on this day, the soldiers have come. There's one problem. They brought an order to have us to expel us, but they can't read their own map. They brought this strange thing that looks more like a barcode from the supermarket than a map. They don't understand it. They call their commanders who don't really understand it. The police arrive, they don't understand it. And yet they've detained us for not having obeyed a map, or according to a map that they can't even read themselves, and admitted to us. But all this takes a lot of time, and we're sitting around for several hours, and we talk. And I tell them about Rabbi Hirsch. I ask them if they understand what they've been asked to do today. Some of these people, and they can be good kids, but if I say, that we're in the occupied territories, according to Israel, this is not Israel. Or I tell them, this outpost, there are settlements which Israel considers legal, although most of the world does not, and outposts which even Israel is not authorized. And when I tell them that this is an unauthorized, illegal outpost, they say, like, what planet have you come from? I mean, and so we're talking. And what I say is, you don't owe me an answer. And I know you're in uniform, you have to obey the orders you were given. But you're also a citizen. You're also a person. You owe yourself to know and to think about what you were asked to do today and what it's really about. Some days we don't get very far. Some days a commanding officer forbids people to engage with us. Once down in the Negev, in the village of El-Rakib, a village that's been demolished over 130 times now. But because of our work, it hasn't been entirely destroyed, turned into a forest. And the police start an arrest procedure. They already have my ID card, I'm already in the vehicle. And then it comes over the walkie-talkie. Release him, but really arrest him if he says one more word of Torah. But on this day, we're engaging, and I don't know what will last, what will sink in. But we left after we finally were released, shaking hands. We told them we would be back if necessary until these shepherds have the right to make a living off their own lands. But the point is that was a day where it was about conflict, but it was also about seeing through that conflict to find something that was our shared humanity, maybe some shared values. Arguably, the human rights situation in Israel today is the worst it's ever been in the 23 years that I've been doing this. We are facing a government which is doing everything it can to undermine our legal system, to delegitimize human rights workers and organizations, which has given unbridled support to some of those who want to dispossess Palestinians, to those who want to deny shelter to African asylum seekers who have come simply fleeing for their lives. And after this same attack, which I alluded to before, a reporter asked me, "Well, you're not really a young guy anymore. Why do you keep on doing this?" You know. And sometimes you do think, couldn't a nice Jewish boy find something better to do than stand in front of bulldozers? And I was taken aback. The first thing I thought of, frankly, was the story, of course, about Henry David Thoreau. I'm sure many of you know. When he was in jail for refusing to pay war taxes. And his friend, the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, comes to visit him and says, "Henry, why are you in jail?" And his answer, of course, was, "Ralph, why aren't you in jail?" I do what I do, and we do what we do, because I do believe that God put us on this earth for what we in the Jewish tradition call tikkun olam, what some people in the Christian tradition call co-creationism, this idea that we are God's partners in creating a more repaired, holy, and sanctified world. Speaking as someone who's had bombs go off not far from my home, I'm doing it for the sake of my children. I'm making a better world for them. I couldn't do what I do if I had given up on my fellow Israelis. We did an opinion poll back in 2013 in my former organization. We work with the Bedouin in the so-called unrecognized villages, most of which existed before the State of Israel, or are places where the state moved them. I've been putting a lot of work in recently for the village of Hiran, a Bedouin village. The elders remember the day in 1956 when they were moved there, and the army officer Chaim Sui gave them written and oral promises that this was a place that they would be able to rebuild their lives, which they did. Until now, that the plan is to build a Jewish community called Hiran on the rubble of Bedouin Hiran. But we asked on this opinion poll, 90% of Israeli Jews subscribe to the statement, the Bedouin are taking over the Negev. So we said, let's unpack that. What do you mean by that? So the 70% thought that the Bedouin wanted 25% of the Negev or more. The median was 43.9%. So for another gold-plated matzo ball, if all the outstanding Bedouin land claims were to be recognized and honored, much less than the 2.6 million dunam, 4 dunam to an acre, that the pre-state Zionist movement listed as belonging to the Bedouin back in 1920, what percentage of the Negev are we talking about? Anyone want to guess? Throw out a number.
15%?
Less than 15.
8.
Less than 8. 5.4%. And your average Israeli Jew said, well, I'm not sure we believe you because that's not what we've heard in the media. But if that's true, well, that sounds fair. We repeated that study in 2016 with even better numbers, and a clear majority of Israeli Jews said we should be fair to the Bedouin, we should not be demolishing the villages, we should be recognizing villages. We're not sure, we're convinced that all the land claims are true, but it's more important to hold together the fabric of Israeli society than the fight of every dunam. And what this says to me, I could not do what I do if I thought that my fellow Israelis were simply an incorrigibly evil people. And I don't think that my job is simply to rub the nose of the naughty puppy in the mess it's made. Rather, our job is to say to our fellow Israelis, I know that you are good and decent people who want to do the right thing. Even when almost every single Israeli Jew will say we have the most moral army in the world. It's not that we have the most immoral army in the world by any means. And I never forget, of course, that I live in a country that allows me to do what I do, where in so many parts in this world, if I were to come on a speaking tour like this, I wouldn't be allowed home, and if I was allowed home, my life would be in danger. We're not anywhere close to being the worst human rights violators in the world. Not even close. Although that's cold comfort because it's my country. But Israelis don't say that because they're trying to do propaganda. It's because that's what they aspire to. They want to believe that we have the most moral army in the world. I think they're living in a bubble. I think there's a need for a reality check. But it's not, but when I know that that's what they aspire to, I feel I have something to work with. Our word in Hebrew for prayer is litpalel. It's a reflexive verb. It means to judge oneself. Prayer, God does not need to hear from us that God frees the captives and heals the sick and stands with the oppressed. We need to hear it. If, as we believe, we are created in God's image, then prayer is that moment that we look in the mirror to see how we stand up. We who are commanded to be as godlike as humanly possible. And Tikkun Olam, being God's partner, is helping God by holding up God the mirror, in our case to our fellow Israelis, and say, if you can just, without all the defense mechanisms, take a good look in the mirror, because we know that you're good and decent people, we don't think you're going to see what you thought that you were going to see or what you would like to see. And we can do better. And we can do better. But I could not continue to do what I'm doing after 23 years if I had nothing to show for it. I certainly couldn't come here to ask for your financial support or any other kind of support. You know, 2002, we started acting as human shields. Literally, some of us getting our heads cracked open, standing between Palestinian farmers and settlers and others coming to attack them, simply trying to get to their olive trees. And after doing that year after year, in 2006 we won a high court appeal that it's the obligation of the Israeli security forces to protect Palestinian farmers to get to their land, to every single tree. It's not perfect by any means. I have, some people have their bucket lists. My list is the ones of wrongs that have to be righted before I can ever retire. My friend Ibrahim, who has the unfortunate luck to one of his olive groves is next to Chavat Gilad, one of the most violent outposts. I was with him in 2002 after this place had just been built and then removed by the army, with some of the soldiers ending up in the hospital. But when he got to his land, which he could get to again, he found most of the olives had been stolen. We were attacked by settlers. The army said, no one can come in here until you prove your ownership. You have to have the land surveyed. It was the middle of the Second Intifada. The Palestinians didn't have any freedom of movement. It wasn't so simple. In 2004, he brings the survey. They don't want to pay attention to it. We intervene, and then finally, when that's not enough, we go and we just, we come and we start picking the olives. The army stops us, freezes. I spend 2 hours sitting in the police station with the head of the outpost, the founder, and eventually the word comes, it's your land, Palestinian land, you can continue to farm. I tell the soldiers, there's going to be a revenge activity tonight. Sure, we'll guard. 26 trees had their the olive stolen, and they found an Israeli ID on the ground. And nobody was ever brought to justice. Today, on an average, from year to year, somewhere between 50 and 100% of Ibrahim's olives are stolen before the appointed day where the army is guarding him to get to that olive grove. He used to have 450 trees, now he has 230. This year we were writing legal letters, we're begging, we're asking, we're negotiating, we're talking to let him in early and to guard the grove until they do so. When they didn't, we went in without permission to start harvesting olives until we got kicked out. After that, I set up like a little watch post as much as I could, even in the middle of the night in a not very safe area. But eventually, and sent a real-time video clip to the army when I thought I saw from afar heavy equipment in the olive grove, and sure enough, when he finally gets in, they cleared land to build yet one more building inside his olive grove, and another 22 trees were gone. Olives stolen from another 60 trees. This man used to make a living off his land, and now has to work as a day laborer inside Israel at age 65 or so. A few hours before getting on a plane to come here, I was meeting with the army about this and other examples as we were showing our results of our study, which we're now showing of how in so many places that high court decision from 2006 is not being sufficiently honored. And I can't retire until Ibrahim can live off his land again. But I also know that many farmers are getting to lands they couldn't get to for 2, 5, 10, 15 years. And if we were just have a transporter beam and go to Palestine right now, we would actually see Israeli soldiers guarding those farmers. So I know we made a difference. I know we made a difference when we ended the so-called Israeli Wisconsin plan, welfare to work, a lovely idea, except for when you think that the problem is not the unemployment, but the unemployed. Today, from the early 90s, not one single unit of public housing was being built or acquired. We have a government that's building public housing for Israelis. essential for helping people get out of poverty. We still have problems in terms of criteria that have nothing to do with need. But we're working on that as well. Khan al-Ahmar. Been in the news. Arguably Khan al-Ahmar and Susia, two communities which are now just, our defense minister who just announced his resignation had vowed in August of 2017 that his ministry was well in the way of preparations to wipe these communities off the face of the earth. They are not the only communities in danger, but they are the communities that have become symbols for the settlers, for the international community, on all sides, and everybody's been putting tremendous resources into saving these communities or destroying these communities. When I was in Washington just before our Rosh Hashanah, our Jewish New Year, a year ago, after the news that the intent to demolish, and I asked, I said at a congressional hearing, in a day I'll be home, and in our Jewish prayers we will pray Unatana Tokef. This is the day that we'll decide who will live and who will die in the coming year, who will do well and who will suffer. And if that's supposed to be the job of the heavenly court, it's you here in Washington who will decide whether the 15-year-old boy from Susia, standing next to me, will have a home in a year or not. Thank God he still does. In Khan al-Ahmar, if you had asked me 4 weeks ago, I would have said, it's all over. Any day now the bulldozers are going to come. And basically what we can do is think about the day after. But that doesn't mean we gave up. Israelis, Palestinians, internationals spent our time together in that community day and night. Kind of felt like the Alamo. At one point I didn't leave for over 3 days because if the bulldozers came, we might not be allowed back in. And when sometimes, in court, the prosecuting attorney will always ask, well, why were you there? Didn't you know that was going to be trouble? As if that's incriminating. All I can say is that if someday, God forbid, someone comes to demolish your home, you wouldn't want to be alone. Nobody should be alone. We try to up the pressure coming from the international community, and eventually I think we succeeded. And there were clandestine talks, which I can't fully talk about, but I think this was another case where my 23-year-old track record helped a bit, because neither side trusted the other. It doesn't mean that there's I can't say that Khan al-Ahmar is safe today. But with cautious optimism, it seems like we've saved that community, because Saturday night, a couple weeks ago, inside information says the bulldozers are coming the next day or the day after. And our Prime Minister announced that it was being frozen. There still haven't been real actual negotiations, but the place that they wanted them to move to has been dismantled. In just a second, we're going to move to Q&A. Questions, thoughts, arguments. But there are a couple important lessons that have to be learned from this story. First of all, nobody does it alone. I'll be honest in saying my role was pretty modest. I think important, but modest. What we do together. All the people working to save Khan al-Ahmar, the partnership that we have with those of you who support us either financially and or by speaking to your Congress people or all the other things that need to be done. Within my organization, when I was kind of running out of ideas and my chairperson kicked me in the rear end and said, this is not the time to stop. And it's a lesson that even when everything looks totally dark, totally impossible, a lost cause, I do think that if I were Catholic, that my patron saint would be St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. But it's never a lost cause. This was a lesson why we must never give up and should never lose hope. So many people in Israel and Palestine have given up hope. When I come to this country, I hear from activists who say, I'll be an activist all my life on anything but not on your issues because there's no hope. But together we create hope. When we are stubborn and determined and faithful, there's no guarantee. If there was an issue that I knew success was guaranteed, I wouldn't take it. Let somebody else do it. I look for the issues where there's no promise of success, but a chance of success. And so that is what I'm here to ask you to be a part of. A coalition of hope. Aguda Echad. One great coalition of faith. Saying we can do this. We can create a better and more just Israel. An Israel that lives up to our own Declaration of Independence. That this should be a country based on Torat Tzedek B'Shalom, freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel, that guarantees total social and political equality for all, regardless of religion, nationality, or gender. So I hope that you will be partners with us. Those of you who can write an additional check tonight, all the information is here. If not, you can take one of the envelopes. If you sign up the sign-up sheets, you'll get sometimes funding appeals, but you'll also get urgent action appeals. And so I hope that as I turn it over to your questions and thoughts, that all of you will, in whatever way you can, be with us in a coalition of hope. Thank you. Okay, your turn.
I'd like to just interject a little bit right here because I know on our announcements that we said that we would close at 8 o'clock. And
Wow.
it's past that, and I wanted to make sure that our guests immediately felt free to go and bless their way. But we'd like to encourage you to stay and have any questions you want to pose to the rabbi. Also, feel free to grab a box if there's leftovers that you want to take with you that will have a snack. Sure. There's some boxes over here. So we'll just do a little transition now because a few people have to.
Okay, I'm sorry, I wasn't watching the clock. I wasn't told just when to stop, and it is kind of a rabbinic disease. Sound bites are not my thing. But please, those of you who can stay, questions, thoughts, arguments, whatever, please. Yes?
So, in response to Israeli policy towards Palestine, among a lot of young people in the United States, the BDS Israel movement has gotten some popularity. Mm-hmm. The boycott, divest, sanctions movement. What are your thoughts on...
I'll repeat the question.
What are your thoughts on the efficacy of that movement?
So the question is about BDS. You know, I started my really political activity in many ways as a college student in the anti-apartheid movement. And our goal was to get universities, in my case Harvard, to take out of their portfolio corporations doing business in South Africa. It's also a lesson about hope. You or students, don't take my example, maybe. I spent more time in protest activity than in the classroom. My grades reflected it. And I felt a failure when after 4 years, and having given my heart and soul, we had not succeeded. Even the student body had moved on to other issues. But it happened the year after. And it would not have happened if it had not been for what we were doing. But arguably, that form of divestiture helped end apartheid. I remember myself a few years later, early 91 or whatever it was, protesting or against a war in Iraq and in favor of sanctions. Well, we got both. Arguably, the war was worse than the sanctions, but I think we all know today the sanctions did nothing to impact on Saddam Hussein's regime. It only caused more suffering for average Iraqis. So you cannot just say push buttons A and B and you're going to get to C. Most people would say the reason why it worked in South Africa was not financial but psychological. South Africans so much wanted to be a part of the community of nations. In Israel, most Israelis assume that the world hates us, that everybody out there is anti-Semitic. And the BDS movement, from that point of view, has helped our demagogues to say, this just proves what we've always said, that we should ignore the world because they're all anti-Semites. So now, the BDS movement is very broad. There are those who are anti-occupation, and there are those who are anti-Israel, period. For no Israel in any form is not acceptable. And there are those who would say that we are so dysfunctional that only pressure from outside will change anything, and those would say that pressure is important, but there also has to be a changing of hearts and minds from within. So, for those who don't think there's any legitimacy to Israel in any shape or form, then what I have to say isn't very helpful, and neither to those who think there is no importance to changing Israeli and maybe Palestinian hearts and minds. But if you do say you are anti-occupation but not anti-Israel, and what we think counts for something, and you want some sliver of hope of bypassing our Israeli demagogues and getting that message across. I'm not a fan of cultural or academic boycotts. I do everything in my power not to buy settlement products myself. It's a problem if you like organic food, because so much of the organic food in Israel is produced in settlements. And I would support sanctions or divesting or whatever from corporations or what businesses, not just because they're in Israel, but because they're directly building settlements or something very directly. And if you want any chance of getting through to Israelis, I would say that the money you pull out of that corporation building settlements should be reinvested in something positive in Israel. And thereby saying, we're not anti-Israel, we're anti-occupation. I also would challenge those who get up in arms against BDS and say, all right, this is an attempt to use nonviolent methods to put pressure on Israel. We obviously don't want violence. And so if you're also opposed to all forms of BDS, then what are Palestinians allowed to do? It looks like people need to get going. Maybe informally I'll hang out and answer more questions. I'll just maybe finish by saying the following. Wherever you are, whether it be in Portland or in Israel or Palestine or everywhere where you may be, if there is one thing that I heard time after time today about Gary and Nancy is that they're stubborn. They don't give up. To be an activist, you have to have a predilection for beating your head against the wall. But every once in a while, the wall breaks. Once I'm out, how many people here have seen the movie Budrus? Right, it's a great movie. There's a whole series of movies by an organization called Just Vision about the conflict, documentaries. This is about the village of Budrus, would use nonviolent action to save their olive grove from the route of the separation barrier. We had a cameo appearance because one day we planted trees along the route that they were going to come to build the barrier. And a rabbi who was with me that day told me a story. It's so amazing, I'm not sure that I even believe it myself. But he said, I was talking to one Palestinian and I pointed to another young man off to the side wearing a bandana and he said, "Who's that?" He said, "Well, that guy's Hamas and he's wearing the bandana because he intends to carry out a suicide attack." The man comes back to him at the end and says, "I have to tell you, he saw you all here. Maybe the first time he ever saw Israelis coming to stand shoulder to shoulder with Palestinians." He said, "I'm not going to do it." I don't know that. I have a hard time even believing that one, but I don't know how many times when I've gone to rebuild a demolished home and Palestinian parents have insisted that their children meet us, and like deja vu, time after time. The same, our 10-year-old son has just seen his home demolished in front of his eyes. He's just seen his parents humiliated in front of his eyes. What do we say to our 10-year-old child when he says, "I want to grow up and be a terrorist"? We want our child to know that not every Israeli comes with guns to demolish our homes, that there are Israelis who come to stand shoulder to shoulder with us to rebuild our homes. Only I, as an Israeli, particularly a religious Israeli, because some of the deepest held stereotypes that Palestinians have about Israelis are about religious Israelis, can empower the Palestinian peacemaker when the Palestinian on the street is told to say, "Make peace with them?" Impossible. I need Palestinians to empower me. Once I'm picking olives with a young man. Turns out he's at the time part of Yasser Arafat's presidential guard. And if I'm blown away to be working with someone from the presidential guard, he's 10 times more blown away to be working with an Israeli rabbi. He says, "Why are you here? This makes no sense. Explain this to me." I talked about Jewish tradition of peace, of human rights, of tikkun olam, of justice. He says, for us Palestinians, there is no justice. And although we were still a few months away from our upcoming holiday of Hanukkah, we're at the darkest time of year. On the first night, we'd light 1 candle, second night, 2 candles. I said, when all is dark, you start by lighting that first candle. We have a wonderful image in our Jewish tradition to look at all of life as 2 perfectly balanced scales, on both the personal and on the cosmic level. You never know, when you think you're beating your head against the wall, what little act that you take that seems meaningless, irrelevant, ineffective at the time, whether that will be the act that both on the personal and cosmic levels will tip those scales one way or the other. And so my parting hope and wish and blessing and prayer for all of us, whether it be the Middle East, or any of the other spheres of our personal and public and spiritual lives, is that we should always have the courage and the wisdom and the faith to tip the scales in the right direction. Keni Ratzon, inshallah, may it be God's will. Thank you.